The dust cloud rose behind her wagon like a phantom chasing her across the endless Texas plains, and Eleanor Hartwell knew that if she stopped now, after 3 weeks of traveling alone through territory where most men feared to tread, she would never forgive herself for the cowardice. The summer of 1878 had been merciless, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather, and every mile she had covered from St. Louis to this God-forsaken stretch of wilderness had tested her resolve in ways she had never imagined. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to embroidery needles and piano keys, were now calloused and raw from gripping the reins. Her face, despite the bonnet she wore religiously, had been kissed by the sun until freckles scattered across her nose like copper pennies. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and traveling alone to find a man she had never met in person, but had corresponded with for 8 months through carefully penned letters that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. His name was James Colton Brennan, and he was a rancher in the town of Red Creek, Texas, population 217 according to his last letter. He had written to her through a matrimonial advertisement, something Eleanor would have scorned a year ago when her life had been comfortable and predictable in her father's house. But her father had died suddenly of a heart condition, leaving debts that swallowed their modest estate whole. Her older brother had inherited what little remained and promptly married a woman who made it clear that Eleanor was not welcome under their roof for long. The choice had been simple: find employment as a governess or seamstress, living on scraps and charity, or answer one of the many advertisements from Western men seeking wives. James's letters had been different from the others she had tentatively responded to. He wrote with honesty about the hardships of ranch life, never sugarcoating the isolation or the work required. But he also wrote with a gentle humor and a respect for her intelligence that had been rare in her experience with men. He asked about her thoughts on books, on politics, on the future of the West. He told her about his cattle, about the land he had worked for 10 years to build into something worthwhile, about his dreams of creating a legacy. He had lost his first wife to childbirth 5 years earlier, and the grief in his words had been palpable but not overwhelming. He was ready to live again, he had written, and he hoped she might be the woman brave enough to take a chance on a life so different from what she had known. Eleanor had written back honestly about her circumstances, refusing to pretend she was coming from anything but desperation. His response had surprised her. He had written that he admired her honesty and that he believed the strongest foundations were built on truth, not illusion. They had exchanged photographs, his showing a tall man with dark hair and serious eyes, weathered by sun and work but not unkind. Hers had shown her as she was, no artificial posing or flattering angles, just Eleanor with her honey-brown hair and hazel eyes, and the determined set to her jaw that her mother had always said made her look stubborn. After 6 months of letters, he had proposed marriage and offered to send money for her passage. She had accepted but refused the money, having just enough from selling her mother's jewelry to make the journey on her own terms. She had written to tell him she would arrive in Red Creek by mid-August, and he had responded with detailed directions and a promise to be waiting. Now, as her wagon crested another rise and she saw the cluster of buildings in the distance that could only be Red Creek, Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made her breathless. The town was small, as James had warned, just a main street with perhaps 20 buildings visible from her vantage point. Beyond it, she could see the vast expanse of ranchland stretching toward distant hills that shimmered in the afternoon heat. She had made it. 3 weeks of sleeping in her wagon with a loaded rifle across her lap. 3 weeks of rationing food and water. 3 weeks of dodging storms and navigating by the maps James had sent her. She had forded rivers that nearly swept her wagon away, had startled a family of wild pigs that had charged at her horse until she fired a warning shot, had endured 2 nights of such profound loneliness that she had wept into her hands. But she had made it, and the pride that surged through her was unlike anything she had ever felt. The main street of Red Creek was quiet in the midday heat, with only a few horses tied to hitching posts and a dog sleeping in the shade of the general store. Eleanor guided her wagon toward what appeared to be a saloon, hoping someone inside could direct her to the Brennan ranch. Her dress was covered in dust, her hair had escaped its pins in wild tendrils around her face, and she knew she looked nothing like the composed woman in the photograph she had sent James. But there was nothing to be done about it now. She had barely set the brake on her wagon when a man emerged from the saloon, tall and broad-shouldered. His dark hair slightly longer than in his photograph, but his eyes exactly as serious and searching as she remembered. James Brennan stopped on the wooden sidewalk, his gaze moving from her wagon to her face, and she saw something flicker in his expression that made her breath catch. Eleanor Hartwell. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, roughened by years of calling orders across open range. Yes. She tried to climb down from the wagon with some dignity, but her legs were stiff from hours of sitting and she stumbled slightly. He was there in an instant, his hands steadying her by the elbows, and she found herself looking up into eyes that were the color of dark coffee. "You came alone." It was not a question, but a statement filled with something that sounded like wonder and concern mixed together. "I did." Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "I know you offered to send money for a stagecoach or wagon train escort, but I preferred to make my own way." James did not immediately respond. His hands were still on her elbows, and she could feel the calluses on his palms even through the fabric of her sleeves. He was studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. 3 weeks alone from St. Louis, he finally said, and there was something in his tone that made her uncertain whether he was angry or impressed. 3 weeks and 2 days, actually. I took a wrong turn near Austin and lost half a day finding my way back to the main trail. She tried for levity, but her voice came out shakier than she intended. James released her elbows and took a step back, and she saw him shake his head slowly. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? There are bandits working these roads, not to mention Comanche raiding parties further west. A woman alone is a target for every kind of evil that exists out here." Eleanor felt her pride surge into defensiveness. "I am aware of the dangers, Mr. Brennan. I am not a fool. I took precautions, I traveled during daylight hours, and I can shoot well enough to defend myself if necessary." "Can you?" He raised an eyebrow, and she bristled at the skepticism in his voice. "I hit a wild pig at 20 yards when it charged my wagon near the Brazos River." She crossed her arms over her chest. "Would you like me to demonstrate my marksmanship, or would you prefer to simply acknowledge that I made it here safely despite your concerns?" For a moment, James just stared at her, and Eleanor wondered if she had ruined everything with her sharp tongue. Her mother had always warned her that men did not appreciate women who spoke too boldly. But then something extraordinary happened. James Brennan smiled, a slow-spreading warmth that transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly handsome. "That courage won my heart," he said quietly, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. "I have been worried sick since I got your letter saying you were coming alone. I rode out to meet you twice but must have missed you on the trail. I thought I would have to marry you out of obligation and respect for our correspondence, Miss Hartwell, but seeing you standing here covered in trail dust after 3 weeks alone in the wilderness, I realize I might actually have the extraordinary fortune to marry a woman I can admire." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "That is quite forward, Mr. Brennan. We have only just met in person. Call me James. And yes, it is forward, but I learned years ago not to waste time on false modesty or playing games with words. Life out here is too uncertain for that." He glanced at her wagon, taking in the worn canvas cover and the obviously depleted supplies. "You must be exhausted and starving. Let me take you to get a proper meal at the boarding house and then we can talk about what comes next." What comes next? Eleanor repeated, suddenly uncertain. I thought we had agreed in our letters to marry. We did. James's expression grew serious again. But that was before I knew you were brave enough or foolish enough to cross half of Texas alone. That changes things. Changes them how? Eleanor felt a flutter of panic in her chest. Had she come all this way only to be rejected? James seemed to sense her fear because his expression softened. Changes them because now I want to give you a real choice. I want you to see the ranch, to understand what you would be agreeing to. I want you to meet my men, to see the work, to spend at least a few days deciding if this is truly what you want. You have already proven you are no coward, Eleanor. That means if you choose to stay, I will know it is because you want to, not because you have no other option. Something in Eleanor's chest, something that had been clenched tight with anxiety for months, began to ease. That is remarkably considerate, James. I told you in my letters that I believe in honesty. He offered her his arm. Now come. Margaret Wilson runs the boarding house, and she makes the best stew in 3 counties. You can get cleaned up, rest, and then tomorrow I will show you the ranch. Eleanor took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the worn cotton of his shirt, and allowed him to guide her down the street. The few townspeople who were out in the heat watched them with undisguised curiosity, and she was aware of how she must look, like some kind of wild woman who had crawled out of the desert. But with James's steady presence beside her, she found she did not care as much as she might have expected. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had been painted white at some point, but was now weathered to a soft gray. Inside, it was blessedly cool, with windows positioned to catch the cross breeze and simple but clean furnishings. A woman in her 50s appeared from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's disheveled state with immediate understanding. This is Eleanor Hartwell, James said simply. She has just arrived from St. Louis after 3 weeks on the trail alone. She needs a room, a bath, and your excellent stew, Margaret. Margaret Wilson's eyebrows rose toward her graying hairline. Alone. Good Lord, girl, you are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most foolish. But there was respect in her voice, not condemnation. Come with me. I will get water heating for a bath, and I have a room on the 2nd floor that stays cooler in the afternoons. Eleanor glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly. I will have your wagon brought to the livery and your belongings brought here. Take your time getting settled. I will come by this evening and we can talk more then. Thank you, James. Eleanor meant it with her whole heart. The kindness in his offer to let her rest before making any decisions was more than she had dared hope for. As Margaret led her up the narrow stairs to a small but spotlessly clean room, Eleanor felt the weight of the past 3 weeks finally settling into her bones. Her entire body ached, her hands were blistered despite the gloves she had worn, and she was quite certain she smelled like a combination of horse, sweat, and prairie dust. The bath will be ready in about 20 minutes, Margaret said, setting fresh towels on the bed. I will bring up the stew when you are done washing. You look like you have not had a decent meal in days. I have not, Eleanor admitted. I ran out of most of my supplies 2 days ago. I have been eating hardtack and dried beef. Margaret shook her head with a mixture of admiration and concern. James Brennan is a good man, one of the best I know. But this is a hard life out here, Miss Hartwell. If you are thinking of marrying him, you need to understand what you are agreeing to. Ranch wives work from dawn to dusk. There is no society here, no theaters or concerts or tea parties. There are dust storms, droughts, cattle thieves, and isolation that can drive a person mad if they are not prepared for it. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed, grateful to be off her feet. I understand that, Mrs. Wilson, or at least, I understand it as much as anyone can without living it. But I have no illusions about my circumstances. My father died leaving debts. My brother made it clear I was a burden, and my options in St. Louis were limited to becoming a governess or a seamstress, living on charity and gratitude. At least here, I have the chance to build something of my own, to be a partner rather than a dependent. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You have got sense and spine, I will give you that. James needs both in a wife. His first wife, God rest her soul, was a sweet girl but fragile. She never quite adjusted to the isolation, and I think the loneliness was harder on her than the work. James blamed himself after she died, thought he should have sent her back east where she would have been happier. She moved toward the door, then paused. He is a good man who deserves a strong woman. I hope you might be that woman, Miss Hartwell. After Margaret left, Eleanor stood and moved to the small window that overlooked the main street. She could see her wagon being led away by a young man, probably toward the livery James had mentioned. Beyond the town, the land stretched endlessly, brown and harsh under the unforgiving sun. It was nothing like the green, civilized landscapes of Missouri. It was raw and wild and dangerous. And yet, Eleanor found herself drawn to it in a way she could not fully explain. There was an honesty to this place, a stripping away of all pretense and social artifice. Here, what mattered was strength, courage, and the willingness to work. Here, she would not be judged by her lack of dowry or her sharp tongue or her unfashionable insistence on speaking her mind. Here, she could be herself. The bath, when it came, was heaven. Eleanor soaked in the copper tub until her skin was pink and all the trail dust had been scrubbed away. She washed her hair twice, working out the tangles with Margaret's rose-scented soap, and only emerged when the water had gone lukewarm. The stew that appeared on a tray while she was combing out her wet hair was thick with beef and vegetables, and she ate every drop along with 3 slices of fresh bread slathered with butter. By the time James knocked on her door that evening, Eleanor had napped for 2 hours, dressed in her least wrinkled dress of deep blue cotton, and pinned her hair up in a style that was simple but presentable. She opened the door to find him cleaned up as well, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a fresh shirt and dark trousers that looked like they had been saved for special occasions. You look rested, he said, and there was warmth in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. I feel almost human again, Eleanor replied. Thank you for your patience. I know I must have looked like I had been dragged behind my wagon when I arrived. James smiled. You looked like a woman who had survived 3 weeks in the wilderness alone. That is nothing to be ashamed of. He held out his arm. Would you like to walk with me? The evening is cooler, and I thought I could show you a bit of the town before it gets dark. Eleanor took his arm, and they descended the stairs together. Margaret gave them an approving nod as they passed through the front room, and then they were out on the street where the brutal heat of the day had softened into something more bearable. Red Creek was indeed small, but as James walked her down the main street, Eleanor began to see the bones of a real community. There was a general store that also served as the post office, a blacksmith shop where she could hear the ring of hammer on anvil, a small church with a white steeple, a doctor's office, the saloon James had emerged from earlier, and several other businesses that catered to the ranchers and farmers in the surrounding area. It is not much compared to St. Louis, James said, and she heard defensiveness in his tone. No, Eleanor agreed honestly, but it seems like an honest place. I appreciate that. James glanced down at her. Tell me about your journey. What was the hardest part? Eleanor considered the question as they walked. The loneliness, I think. The physical challenges were difficult, but I could manage those. It was the nights that were worst, when I would camp and there would be nothing but darkness and silence and my own thoughts. I kept thinking about what I was leaving behind, about my parents who are both gone now, about the life I had always assumed I would have that disappeared so quickly. She paused, then continued. But I also thought about what might be waiting for me here. Your letters sustained me, James. Reading them over again each evening reminded me why I was making this journey. I wish I could have spared you the hardship of traveling alone, James said quietly, when I think about all the things that could have happened to you on that trail. But they did not happen, Eleanor interrupted gently. I am here safe and whole, and I learned something important about myself on that journey. I learned that I am stronger than I believed, that I can face fear and uncertainty and keep moving forward. That might be the most valuable thing I have ever discovered about myself." James stopped walking, turning to face her fully. They were at the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open range. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed impossible in their intensity. "I need to be honest with you about something," James said, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "I told you in my letters that I lost my first wife to childbirth. What I did not tell you was how much that loss changed me. For years after Catherine died, I buried myself in work, in building the ranch, in anything that would keep me from feeling the grief. I became hard, Eleanor. My men respect me, but they also keep their distance because I am not an easy man to know." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "When I started corresponding with you, it was because I was lonely and I thought a wife would ease that loneliness. I was practical about it, treating it almost like a business arrangement, but your letters changed that. You wrote with such honesty, such intelligence and humor that I started to feel something I had not felt since Catherine died. I started to feel hope." He took her hand, his calloused thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And then you arrived today after traveling 3 weeks alone through dangerous territory, looking exhausted and fierce and beautiful, and I realized that hope was not enough. I want more than companionship, Eleanor. I want a true partnership with a woman strong enough to stand beside me in this hard land. I want love, real love, not just mutual respect and convenience." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "And you think we might find that love?" "I think we have already begun to find it through our letters," James said. "I think the woman who wrote to me about philosophy and politics and her dreams of seeing the frontier is the same woman standing before me now. And I think if you give us both time to truly know each other, we might discover something rare and precious." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "That is what I want too, James. I did not come here just to escape my circumstances. I came here because your letters made me feel understood in a way I have never experienced. I came here because I believed we might build something meaningful together." James raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. "Then let us take our time, stay at the boarding house for a few weeks. Let me court you properly. Come out to the ranch, meet my men, see the work. And at the end of that time, if you still want to marry me, I will be the luckiest man in Texas. And if you decide you do not want to marry me?" Eleanor asked, needing to voice the fear. "That will not happen," James said with such certainty that she felt her anxiety ease. "But if for some reason you decide this life is not for you, I will personally escort you to wherever you want to go and make sure you have the funds to start fresh. I will not trap you here out of obligation, Eleanor. Whatever happens between us, it has to be freely chosen." They stood there as the sun continued its descent, their hands joined, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. This was not the fairy tale romance she had read about in novels. There was no grand ball, no passionate declarations, no sweep of courtship conventions. Instead, there was honesty, respect, and the tentative beginning of something that felt more solid and real than any fantasy. "I would like to see your ranch tomorrow," Eleanor said softly. "I would like to understand the life you are offering me." James smiled, and in the fading light he looked younger, less burdened. "I will pick you up after breakfast. Wear your most practical clothes. It will be a long day, but I promise to show you everything, the good and the difficult." They walked back to the boarding house as stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, talking easily about small things. James pointed out constellations and told her stories about the town's residents, and Eleanor found herself laughing at his dry humor. When they reached the boarding house door, James hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Sleep well, Eleanor, and thank you for being brave enough to come here." Eleanor watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, her hand pressed against where his lips had touched her forehead, and she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, She had made the right choice after all. The next morning dawned clear and already hot by the time Eleanor finished breakfast. She wore her most practical traveling dress, a brown cotton that would not show dust, and sturdy boots that had served her well on the trail. Margaret had offered her a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, and Eleanor accepted it gratefully. James arrived with a wagon just after 8, and his smile when he saw her ready and waiting was worth every moment of the long journey. "Good morning. Are you ready to see what ranch life really looks like?" "I am," Eleanor said, climbing up onto the wagon seat beside him with considerably more grace than she had managed the previous day. The ride to the Brennan Ranch took about 30 minutes, following a well-worn trail that cut through grazing land, where cattle dotted the landscape like brown boulders. James explained his operation as they rode, detailing the challenges of raising cattle in Texas where water could be scarce, and the market was unpredictable. "I have about 2,000 head right now," he told her. "Most of them are longhorns, tough enough to survive on limited water and sparse grazing. I employ 6 full-time ranch hands plus a cook. During roundup and branding season, I bring on additional temporary workers. It is a constant battle to keep everything running smoothly, but I love it. There is something satisfying about building something from nothing, about working with the land rather than against it." The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. It was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It was not fancy, but it was solid and well-maintained, speaking of pride and care. "I built most of it myself," James said, and she heard pride in his voice. "The men helped with the raising, but I did the planning and much of the carpentry work. Catherine never got to see it finished. She died while we were still living in the original cabin." He pointed to a smaller structure about 50 yards from the main house. "I use that for storage now, but it was home for my first 5 years here." As they approached, several men emerged from the barn, clearly curious about the woman James had brought with him. Eleanor straightened her spine, knowing she was being evaluated, and met their gazes directly. James introduced her to each man in turn. There was Tom Whitaker, the foreman, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Miguel Reyes and his younger brother Carlos, both expert horsemen who had been with James for 3 years. Sam Porter, barely 20 but already showing the competence of a seasoned ranch hand. And finally, William Chen, who handled the cooking and had come to Texas from California where his family had worked on the railroads. Miss Hartwell traveled alone from St. Louis, James told his men, and Eleanor saw their expressions shift from polite curiosity to genuine respect. "Alone." Tom Whitaker repeated, "Ma'am, that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, begging your pardon." "A bit of both, I suspect," Eleanor said with a smile, "but I am here and I am grateful for the welcome." William Chen stepped forward with a slight bow. "I will prepare a special lunch to celebrate your arrival, Miss Hartwell. It is not often we have a guest, especially one who has traveled so far." Over the next several hours, James gave Eleanor a thorough tour of the ranch operations. He showed her the barn where they kept the horses, explaining his breeding program and introducing her to each animal like they were family. He took her to see the cattle grazing in the near pasture, explaining the different bloodlines and his plans for improving his herd. He showed her the bunkhouse where his men lived, simple but clean, and the smokehouse where they preserved meat for the winter months. But it was when they entered the main house that Eleanor truly began to understand what James was offering her. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with furniture that was clearly handmade but showed skill and care. There was a large kitchen with a good stove, a dining room with a table that could seat 10, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace and shelves lined with books. "You read," Eleanor said, moving to examine the titles. There were agricultural manuals and veterinary guides, but also Shakespeare, Dickens, some poetry, and several philosophy texts. Catherine loved to read, James said quietly. I started buying books for her to ease the isolation. After she died, I found I enjoyed them myself. It helped pass the long winter evenings. Eleanor pulled out a volume of Wordsworth and opened it, seeing notations in the margins in two different hands, one delicate and flowing, one stronger and more angular. You discussed the poems together. We did, James confirmed. She was better educated than I was. She taught me to appreciate literature in ways I had never considered. He paused, then added, I hope that does not make you uncomfortable talking about her. Eleanor replaced the book carefully. Not at all. She was part of your life, part of what shaped you into the man you are now. I would never expect you to pretend she did not exist. She turned to face him. But I also need to know something, James. Can you love again? Truly love someone new, not as a replacement for Catherine, but as a complete person in her own right. James crossed the room to stand before her, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. I have asked myself that question 100 times since I placed that matrimonial advertisement. And the honest answer is that I did not know if I could until I read your first letter. You wrote about loss and grief, and the need to build something new from the ashes of what you had lost. You wrote with such clarity about accepting the past while still reaching for the future. And I realized that you understood something it had taken me 5 years to learn. Catherine will always be part of my history, but she does not have to define my future. I can honor her memory while still opening my heart to someone new. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. I think that is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. I told you I believe in honesty, James said softly. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Now let me show you the upstairs. I want you to see everything before you make your decision. The upstairs held 3 bedrooms, all simply but comfortably furnished. James showed her the room that had been his and Catherine's, now impersonal and clearly unused, with dust covers over the furniture. I have been sleeping in one of the other rooms, he admitted. I could not bring myself to stay in there after she died. Eleanor understood. Some griefs were too immediate to face every day. The other 2 rooms were clearly guest rooms, waiting for purpose. If we married and had children, these would be for them, James said. And I would move the furniture from the master bedroom into one of these so we could start fresh together. I would not ask you to sleep in a bed I shared with another woman, Eleanor. You deserve better than that. His consideration touched her deeply. Many men would not have thought of such things, would have expected a new wife to simply step into the life of the old one without adjustment. But James was offering her a chance to create something new, to make this house truly theirs together. They returned downstairs to find that William had prepared a lunch of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch's garden. The meal was served in the dining room, with Tom and the other ranch hands joining them at James's invitation. Eleanor found herself enjoying the easy camaraderie of these men, who worked hard and appreciated good food and honest conversation. Miguel told stories about breaking horses. Sam described a recent encounter with a rattlesnake that had everyone laughing at his exaggerated terror. And Carlos demonstrated his ability to make his lariat perform tricks that seemed to defy physics. Tom asked Eleanor thoughtful questions about her journey, clearly assessing whether she had the toughness to survive ranch life. And William insisted she try his special apple pie that he swore was the best west of the Mississippi. By the end of the meal, Eleanor felt more relaxed than she had in months. These were good men, honest and hardworking, and they clearly respected James as a boss and a leader. If she married him, they would be part of her daily life, and she found the prospect comforting rather than daunting. After lunch, James took her for a walk along the creek that gave the town its name. It was barely more than a trickle this late in the summer, but James explained that during spring it swelled with snowmelt from the distant mountains and provided crucial water for the ranch. "This land is not easy," James said as they sat on a flat rock overlooking the creek. "There are years when the drought is so bad we lose cattle, years when the winter is so harsh we barely survive. There are rattlesnakes and scorpions and dangers I cannot always predict or prevent. If you choose to stay, Eleanor, you need to understand that there will be times when you question that decision." Eleanor watched the water moving slowly over the rocks, thinking about his words. "I think any life worth living has those moments," she said finally. "My mother used to say that comfort was overrated, that real growth only happened when we challenged ourselves. I did not understand what she meant until after she died and I had to figure out how to survive on my own." She turned to look at him. "I am not afraid of hard work, James. I am not afraid of isolation or discomfort. What I am afraid of is living a small, meaningless life where I never discover what I am truly capable of." James took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You are remarkable, do you know that?" Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am practical and stubborn, according to my brother. Remarkable was never a word anyone used to describe me in St. Louis." "Then they were fools," James said firmly. "A remarkable woman travels 3 weeks alone through dangerous territory because she has the courage to reach for something better. A remarkable woman sits on a rock in the Texas heat discussing philosophy and the meaning of a good life. A remarkable woman looks at a hard future and does not flinch away from it." Eleanor found herself leaning toward him, drawn by the intensity in his eyes and the warmth in his voice. "Kiss me," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. James needed no further invitation. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses, and kissed her softly. It was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses she had read about in novels. Instead, it was tender and questioning, a promise rather than a demand. Eleanor felt something inside her chest bloom open like a flower turning toward the sun. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to marry you, Eleanor Hartwell. I know we agreed to take our time to court properly, but I need you to know that my mind is made up. You are the woman I want to build a life with." "I want that too," Eleanor admitted, "but I also want to do this right. I want to earn the respect of your men to prove I can handle ranch life. I want the townspeople to accept me, not see me as some desperate woman who trapped you into marriage. Give me a month, James. Let me work here, learn the rhythms of this place, show everyone including myself that I belong here." James pulled back to study her face. "You want to work on the ranch, I do. I can learn to cook for the men, to help with the garden, to do whatever needs doing. I am not afraid of hard work, and I would rather earn my place here than have it handed to me." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, it will give us time to truly know each other beyond letters, to make sure this is not just loneliness and attraction but something deeper and more lasting." James smiled slowly. "You are going to fit in here perfectly, but I have one condition. You continue to stay at the boarding house in town, not here at the ranch. I will not have anyone questioning your reputation or suggesting impropriety." "Agreed," Eleanor said. "Though I suspect Margaret Wilson will be disappointed to lose her only boarder." "Margaret will be thrilled to have someone to fuss over," James corrected. "She has been trying to marry me off for years. The fact that I finally found someone on my own will drive her crazy with curiosity." They stayed by the creek until the shadows grew long, talking about everything and nothing. James told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about following his father west after his mother died, about the years of hard work building the ranch from nothing. Eleanor shared stories about her own childhood, about her mother's strength and her father's gentle nature, about the books that had shaped her thinking and the dreams she had harbored before circumstances changed everything. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Eleanor felt like she understood James in a way that went beyond their letters. She saw the man he had become through loss and hard work, the integrity that guided his decisions, and the loneliness that had driven him to seek a wife through correspondence. James drove her back to town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. When they arrived at the boarding house, he helped her down from the wagon and held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Tomorrow I have to ride out with the men to check on the cattle in the far pasture, but I will be back the day after. Will you have dinner with me?" he asked. "I would love that," Eleanor replied. "And James, thank you for today. Thank you for being honest and patient and for giving me the chance to choose this life with full knowledge of what it entails." "Thank you for being brave enough to take that chance," James said. He kissed her hand, then climbed back onto the wagon and drove away into the dusk. Eleanor stood on the porch of the boarding house, watching until he disappeared from view, and she realized that for the first time since her father died, she felt genuinely happy. The next several weeks passed in a blur of activity and discovery. Eleanor quickly established a routine that divided her time between helping Margaret at the boarding house and spending days at the ranch, learning the skills she would need as a ranch wife. Margaret, once she understood Eleanor's determination to prove herself, became an invaluable teacher and ally. "Ranch women need to know how to do everything," Margaret explained as she taught Eleanor how to churn butter, preserve vegetables, and cook for a crowd. "There is no running to the store when you run out of something. You make do with what you have and you learn to be creative. In winter, you might go weeks without seeing anyone from town. You have to be self-sufficient." At the ranch, William Chen took Eleanor under his wing, teaching her the secrets of cooking for hungry ranch hands who worked from dawn to dusk. She learned to make biscuits that were light and fluffy, stews that could stretch to feed unexpected guests, and pies that the men declared were almost as good as William's own. Tom Whitaker taught her about cattle, explaining how to spot illness in the herd and the basics of veterinary care. "A rancher's wife needs to know these things," he told her gruffly. "James cannot be everywhere at once. When he is out on the range, you might be the only one at the house who can handle an emergency." Eleanor learned to ride properly from Miguel, who was patient with her inexperience but firm about safety. "A horse can sense fear," he told her as he taught her to sit properly in the saddle. "You must be confident but not arrogant. Respect the horse and it will take care of you." Carlos taught her to use a rope, showing her the basic throws that might be necessary to catch a stray calf or control a panicking animal. Sam showed her how to identify dangerous snakes and scorpions, crucial knowledge in a land where such creatures were common. Each man contributed to her education, and Eleanor could see them gradually accepting her as more than just James's mail-order bride. She was becoming part of the ranch community, but it was her time with James that Eleanor treasured most. He came to town for dinner at least 3 times a week, and on Sundays, they attended church together, sitting in the pew where James had sat alone for 5 years. The townspeople were curious but kind, and Eleanor made an effort to learn names and faces, to become part of the community rather than remaining an outsider. She met the doctor, an older man named Henry Sutton who had come west after losing his own wife to tuberculosis. She befriended the schoolteacher, a stern woman named Patricia Moore who had been teaching Red Creek's children for a decade. She spent time in the general store, learning from the owner, Mr. Joseph Crawford, about the economy of frontier life and the careful balance of credit and cash that kept small towns functioning. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, James took Eleanor to a spot about a mile from the ranch where a stand of cottonwood trees provided rare shade. He spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked a basket of food that William had prepared. "I wanted to bring you somewhere beautiful," James said as they sat watching the sunset. "This land can be harsh, but it has its moments of grace too." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling completely comfortable with the easy intimacy they had developed. "I see the beauty, James. It is different from anything I knew in Missouri, but it is real and powerful." James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "You have impressed everyone, you know. The men tell me you are a natural ranch hand. Margaret says you are the best student she has ever had, and I have heard nothing but good things from the townspeople. You are making a place for yourself here, Eleanor. I want to belong. Eleanor said simply. Not just as your wife, but as myself. I want to contribute something valuable, to be someone people can depend on. James turned her face toward his and kissed her, deeper this time than that first gentle kiss by the creek. Eleanor responded with a passion that surprised them both, her hands gripping his shirt as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we agreed to wait a month, but I cannot wait any longer, Eleanor. I am in love with you. Not with an idea of you, not with a convenient solution to loneliness, but with you. The real, complicated, brave, stubborn woman who argues with me about philosophy and laughs at my terrible jokes and works harder than anyone I have ever known to prove herself. Marry me and let us start building our life together." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, James, because I love you too. I love your integrity and your kindness and the way you look at me like I am something precious. I love that you gave me time to choose freely, that you never pressured me or tried to trap me. I love the life you are offering me, hard as it might be, because it is an honest life built on truth and respect." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was where she belonged, with this man, in this wild and unforgiving place. They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church in Red Creek. Eleanor wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Margaret had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Miguel had ridden 20 miles to pick from a meadow he knew. James wore a new suit that had been ordered special from the general store, and his hands shook slightly as he placed a gold ring on Eleanor's finger. The entire town turned out for the wedding, cramming into the small church until people were standing in the aisles. Tom Whitaker served as James's best man, and Margaret stood up with Eleanor, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony. Afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch with food that William and several of the town women had been preparing for days. Eleanor danced with James under the stars, with fiddle music played by a traveling musician who happened to be passing through town. She danced with Tom and Miguel and Carlos and Sam, with Dr. Sutton and Mr. Crawford, and half a dozen other men from town. She was spun and twirled until she was breathless and laughing, feeling more joy than she had thought possible. As the party finally wound down and the guests departed, James took Eleanor's hand and led her into the house that was now truly theirs. He had moved furniture as promised, creating a bedroom that held no ghosts of the past. Fresh curtains hung at the windows and wildflowers filled a vase on the dresser. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," James said softly, and Eleanor felt the truth of those words in her soul. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that went beyond physical joining to something deeper and more profound. James was gentle with Eleanor, aware of her inexperience, and she responded with a trust and openness that came from truly knowing and loving the man she had married. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eleanor traced patterns on James's chest with her fingertips. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she admitted. "When I left St. Louis, I was scared and desperate. I had no idea that I would find not just a husband but a partner, a true companion." James kissed the top of her head. "That courage that brought you here, that determination to face the unknown rather than accept a small, limited life, that is what won my heart, Eleanor. From the moment I saw you climb down from that wagon, covered in trail dust and looking fierce as a wildcat, I knew you were extraordinary. I knew that a woman brave enough to travel alone through dangerous territory was a woman who could handle anything life threw at her." "I did not feel brave," Eleanor confessed. "I felt terrified most of the time. But I kept thinking about what my mother used to tell me. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward despite the fear." "Your mother was a wise woman," James said. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Eleanor said with certainty. "She always said the measure of a man was in how he treated people who had no power over him, how he handled adversity, and whether his word meant something. "You excel in all those areas." They talked deep into the night, making plans for their future. James spoke of his dreams to expand the ranch, to improve his breeding stock, to perhaps one day run cattle all the way to the railhead in Kansas. Eleanor shared her own dreams of building a real library in their home, of perhaps starting a small school for ranch children who lived too far from town to attend regular classes, of creating a home that would be a sanctuary from the harshness of frontier life. As Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. 3 weeks alone on the trail had seemed impossible when she started, but she had survived and even thrived. She had discovered a strength in herself that she had never known existed. And that courage, that willingness to risk everything for the chance at something better, had indeed won her a love deeper and truer than anything she had imagined. The first year of their marriage was not easy, but it was filled with a profound satisfaction that made the hardships bearable. Eleanor learned to manage a ranch household, to cook for unexpected guests, to stretch supplies when money was tight. She learned to handle medical emergencies when Dr. Sutton was too far away to reach quickly, stitching up gashes and setting broken bones with Tom's patient instruction. The isolation that Margaret had warned her about was real. There were weeks in winter when the snow made travel impossible, and she saw no one but James and the ranch hands. But Eleanor discovered that she did not mind the solitude as much as she had feared. She had James for companionship and intellectual stimulation, she had her books, and she had the satisfaction of work that mattered. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. James was overjoyed but also terrified, the memory of losing Catherine still raw despite the years that had passed. Eleanor understood his fear, but she refused to let it overshadow the happiness of expecting their first child. "I am stronger than Catherine was," she told him firmly when she caught him watching her with worry in his eyes. "I have survived 3 weeks alone on the frontier, a hard winter, and learning to cook for 8 hungry men. I will survive childbirth too, Doctor." Sutton came out to the ranch regularly to check on Eleanor's progress, and Margaret made plans to come stay at the ranch for several weeks around the baby's due date. The ranch hands treated Eleanor like she was made of spun glass, trying to take over her chores until she firmly told them that being pregnant did not make her an invalid. In November, as the first snows were beginning to dust the hills, Eleanor went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when James's fear seemed justified. But Eleanor was determined, drawing on every bit of the courage and stubbornness that had brought her to Texas. And finally, in the early morning hours, she delivered a healthy baby boy. James wept when he held his son for the first time, and Eleanor knew he was thinking of Catherine and the daughter who had not survived. But there was joy in his tears too, and hope for this new life they had created together. They named him Thomas Henry Brennan, after Tom Whitaker, who had become like family, and Dr. Sutton, who had safely delivered him. Little Tommy had his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes, and from the start, he had a lusty cry that suggested he would be as determined and stubborn as both his parents. The ranch hands were delighted with the new arrival, each man taking a turn holding the baby and swearing he was the finest infant ever born. William baked a special cake to celebrate, Miguel carved a set of wooden toys, Carlos braided a tiny lariat, and Sam whittled a rattle from soft pine. Eleanor recovered quickly from the birth, her strength built up from years of hard ranch work. Within a few weeks, she was back to her normal routine, simply carrying Tommy with her in a sling as she went about her chores. She nursed him while helping William with meal preparation, bounced him on her hip while hanging laundry, and sang to him while she worked in the garden. James was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son. Eleanor would often find them together in the rocking chair James had built, the baby sleeping on his father's chest while James read aloud from whatever book was at hand. The sight never failed to warm her heart. 2 years later, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Grace, honoring James's first wife while also celebrating the grace that had brought them together. Little Katie had her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's serious dark eyes, and she was a quieter baby than Tommy had been, content to watch the world with solemn fascination. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. James's careful breeding program paid off with stronger, healthier cattle. He hired additional hands, expanding the bunkhouse to accommodate them. Eleanor established her small school, teaching not only her own children but the sons and daughters of other ranch families in the area. Every Tuesday and Thursday, wagons would arrive at the Brennan Ranch carrying children eager to learn, and Eleanor would spend hours teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. Life settled into a rhythm that was hard but satisfying. There were still difficult times. A particularly bad drought in their 5th year of marriage killed a third of their cattle and nearly bankrupted them. But Eleanor and James faced the crisis together, cutting costs, working longer hours, and refusing to give up. Tom and the ranch hands stayed on even when James could barely afford to pay them, loyalty built over years of fair treatment and respect. They survived the drought, rebuilt the herd, and emerged stronger than before. Eleanor's school grew until she had nearly 20 students, and the territorial government officially recognized it, providing a small stipend for supplies. James's cattle earned a reputation for quality, and he began to command better prices at market. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Eleanor by taking her back to the spot under the cottonwood trees where he had proposed. The children were staying overnight with Margaret in town, giving them a rare evening alone. "Do you have any regrets?" James asked as they sat on a blanket watching the sunset, much as they had a decade earlier. "About answering my advertisement, about making that journey alone, about choosing this hard life," Eleanor leaned against him, comfortable and confident in her answer. "Not a single regret. This life has been everything I hoped for and more. It has been difficult, yes, but it has also been meaningful. I have built something here with you, James. We have created a family, a home, a place that matters. And I did it because I was brave enough to take a risk." James turned her face toward him, his eyes full of love and respect. "That courage won my heart 10 years ago, and it keeps winning my heart every single day. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Eleanor. You face every challenge with determination and grace. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible after Catherine died." "We have made each other happy," Eleanor corrected gently. "That is what a true partnership means. We built this together." James kissed her, and Eleanor felt the same spark of passion that had been there from the beginning, tempered now by years of shared experiences and deep knowledge of each other. They made love under the stars, celebrating 10 years of marriage and the life they had created together. The years continued to pass with their mix of joys and sorrows. Eleanor gave birth to 2 more children, another boy named William after the cook who had become such an integral part of their family, and finally a daughter they named Margaret, honoring the woman who had welcomed Eleanor to Red Creek and become her dearest friend. Tom Whitaker retired from his position as foreman, though he stayed on the ranch in a small cabin James built for him, continuing to offer advice and wisdom. Miguel took over as foreman, proving himself more than capable of managing the growing operation. Carlos married a woman from town and built his own small ranch on land James sold him at a generous price. Sam eventually became the sheriff of Red Creek, bringing law and order to the growing town. Red Creek itself transformed from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town with a courthouse, a hotel, multiple stores, and eventually even a telegraph office. The railroad reached the area when Tommy was 12, bringing easier access to markets and supplies. The frontier was being tamed, the wild days of the early settlement giving way to something more civilized. Eleanor became a pillar of the community, respected for her intelligence, her work ethic, and her kindness. She helped establish a proper school building in town, though she continued to teach ranch children at her home. She served on the church committee, organized charity drives for families facing hardship, and was always the first to arrive when someone needed help with nursing or cooking during illness or crisis. James expanded the ranch until it was one of the largest and most successful in the region. He never lost his love for the work, still riding out with his men to check on cattle, still making the hard decisions about breeding and selling, still finding satisfaction in a job well done. But he also made time for his family, for evenings reading aloud while Eleanor sewed and the children played at their feet, for Sunday picnics by the creek, for teaching his sons and daughters about the land and the cattle and the satisfaction of honest work. Tommy grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. At 19, he took over much of the day-to-day operations, showing a natural talent for management and a fairness in dealing with the ranch hands that reminded everyone of James. Katie proved to have a gift for healing, apprenticing with Dr. Sutton and eventually taking over his practice when he became too old to continue. William developed a passion for breeding horses, establishing a program that made the Brennan Ranch known across Texas. And little Margaret, who was anything but little by the time she reached 15, showed signs of following in her mother's footsteps as a teacher and community organizer. On their 25th anniversary, the whole town turned out for a celebration at the ranch. The house had been expanded over the years, growing to accommodate their family and the frequent guests who had become part of ranch life. William Chen, now in his 60s and still the best cook in the county, prepared a feast that people talked about for months afterward. As Eleanor stood on the porch watching friends and family celebrate, she felt James's arms wrap around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he murmured in her ear. "I am thinking about the young woman who climbed down from a wagon 25 years ago, terrified and determined in equal measure," Eleanor said softly. "I am thinking about how much has changed since then and how much has stayed the same." "You are still terrified and determined," James teased. Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I am still determined, but I am not terrified anymore. I know now that I can handle whatever life brings. We can handle it together." James cupped her face in his hands, hands that were even more callous now but still gentle when they touched her. "I told you on the day we met that your courage won my heart. I meant it then, and I mean it even more now. You have proven yourself 1,000 times over, Eleanor. You are the bravest person I know." "I learned something important on that journey from St. Louis," Eleanor said. "I learned that courage is not about being fearless. It is about being afraid and moving forward anyway. It is about taking risks because the possible reward is worth the potential cost. It is about believing in yourself even when no one else does." "And what was the reward for your courage?" James asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. Eleanor gestured at the scene before them. Their children laughing with friends, ranch hands who had become family, townspeople who had become community, the land they had worked so hard to build into something lasting. "This," she said simply, "all of this. A life that matters, work that means something, love that runs deeper than I ever imagined possible. That was the reward for being brave enough to travel alone for weeks to reach a town I had never seen, to meet a man I knew only through letters." James kissed her forehead, much as he had that first evening, a gesture that had become their private language of love. "Thank you for being brave, Eleanor. Thank you for taking that risk, for traveling all those miles alone, for giving us a chance. You made my life worth living again." "We made each other's lives worth living," Eleanor corrected. "That is what real love does. It does not complete us or fix us or make us whole. It creates a partnership where we support each other through the hard times and celebrate together in the good times." They stood together on the porch as the sun set over the land they had worked together to build. Two people who had taken a risk on each other and found something rare and precious. Eleanor thought about that young woman who had climbed down from a wagon so long ago, about the courage it had taken to make that journey, about the fear and hope that had driven her forward. She had traveled alone for weeks to reach his town, and in doing so, she had found not just a husband but a partner, not just a home but a purpose, not just survival but a life filled with meaning and love. And when the cowboy had said that courage won his heart, he had spoken a truth that had shaped the next 25 years of their lives together. Courage had won his heart, but love had kept it. Love built on honesty, respect, hard work, and the shared understanding that the best things in life were worth fighting for. As the celebration continued around them, and their children called for them to join the dancing, Eleanor took James's hand and they stepped off the porch together, ready for whatever the future might bring, confident in the knowledge that they would face it side by side, just as they had faced every challenge and celebrated every joy for 25 years. The ranch continued to thrive under the careful stewardship of the family that had built it from nothing. Tommy eventually married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a capable young woman named Sarah, who reminded everyone of Eleanor with her determination and practical wisdom. They gave James and Eleanor their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as wild and energetic as spring colts. Katie became the most sought-after doctor in 3 counties, her skill and compassion making her invaluable to the community. She married a lawyer who had come west to establish a practice in Red Creek, and together they built a house in town where they raised 4 children who were as bright and curious as their mother. William's horse breeding program became so successful that he eventually established his own ranch on land adjacent to his father's. He married Miguel's daughter, Rosa, and their partnership proved as successful in business as it was in marriage. Their horses became famous across Texas for their strength, intelligence, and gentle temperaments. Margaret, true to her nature, became a teacher and activist, fighting for better education opportunities for all children in the territory, regardless of their background or their family's economic circumstances. She married late, at 28, to a newspaper editor who shared her passion for social justice, and together they founded a school specifically for children of ranch hands and farmers who might otherwise never receive an education. As James and Eleanor moved into their 60s, they gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Tommy and his growing family. James still rode out most mornings to check on the cattle, unable to fully retire from the work he loved, but he no longer carried the burden of daily management. Eleanor continued teaching, though on a smaller scale, focusing on students who showed particular promise but lacked resources for further education. They took time to travel, something they had never been able to do during the hard, early years of the ranch. They went to San Antonio and New Orleans, to Denver and San Francisco, seeing the wider world that Eleanor had left behind so long ago. But they always returned to Red Creek with relief, recognizing that the ranch was their true home, the place where their hearts belonged. On a spring afternoon when Eleanor was 65 and James 68, they took a ride together to the spot by the creek where James had first kissed her more than 40 years earlier. The cottonwood trees were fuller now, providing deep shade, and the creek ran higher than it had in years, evidence of a wet winter that promised good grazing. They sat on the rocks where they had sat so many times before, holding hands in comfortable silence. Eleanor's hair was now more silver than brown, and James's face was deeply lined by decades of sun and wind. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had taken a chance on each other so long ago. "You remember what you said to me the day I arrived in Red Creek?" Eleanor asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "I said a lot of things that day," James replied with a smile. "I was nervous as a schoolboy." "You said that my courage won your heart," Eleanor reminded him. "You said it when you saw that I had traveled alone for weeks to reach your town." James nodded slowly. "I remember, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. I had never met anyone as brave as you, Eleanor. You gave up everything familiar and safe to travel into the unknown alone with no guarantee that you would find anything worthwhile at the end of that journey. Eleanor squeezed his hand. I found everything worthwhile. I found you, I found this life. I found out who I really was beneath all the expectations and limitations I had accepted in my old life. That courage has defined our whole life together, James said thoughtfully. You have faced every challenge with the same determination you showed on that journey. Childbirth, drought, financial hardship, illness, loss. You never backed down, never gave up. You taught our children by example what it means to be truly brave. You gave me a safe place to be brave, Eleanor said. That was your gift to me, James. You created a partnership where I knew I could take risks because you would be there to support me. You believed in me even when I doubted myself. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the water flow past, thinking about the life they had built together. 4 children, 11 grandchildren so far with more likely coming. A ranch that had grown from 2,000 head of cattle to more than 10,000. A legacy of honest work and fair dealing that had made the Brennan name respected throughout Texas. I have been thinking about something, James said eventually. About what we leave behind when we are gone. Eleanor looked at him, hearing something in his tone that made her pay close attention. What have you been thinking? I have been thinking that the ranch and the cattle and the land, those things will pass to our children and grandchildren. But the real legacy, the thing I am most proud of, is the story of how we came together. A woman brave enough to travel alone through dangerous territory, and a man smart enough to recognize that courage for what it was. That story says something important about taking risks, about believing in yourself, about the rewards that come from facing your fears. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. That is a beautiful thought, James. I want that story to be remembered, James continued. I want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know about the woman who traveled alone for weeks to reach a town she had never seen, and about the cowboy who fell in love with her courage before he ever saw her face. I want them to know that the greatest love stories are not about fairy tale romances, but about 2 people who choose each other with full knowledge of the challenges ahead and commit to facing those challenges together. Then we should write it down, Eleanor said decisively. We should write our story so that it will not be lost or distorted over time. We should tell the truth about the hardships and the joys, about the fear and the courage, about what it really means to build a life together. And so they did. Over the next several years, in the evenings after supper when the work was done and the house was quiet, Eleanor and James sat together and wrote their story. They wrote about the letters they had exchanged, about Eleanor's journey alone across Texas, about their courtship and marriage, about building the ranch and raising their children. They wrote honestly about the difficulties and the losses, but also about the profound satisfaction of a life built on truth and mutual respect. They wrote about the moment James had first seen Eleanor climb down from her wagon and recognized her courage. They wrote about how that courage had indeed won his heart, but how love had sustained them through everything that followed. They wrote about what it meant to be true partners, supporting each other through hardship and celebrating together in joy. When they finished, they had created a document that was part history, part love letter, and part instruction manual for anyone brave enough to take a risk on an uncertain future. They made copies and gave one to each of their children, with instructions that it should be passed down through the generations. James died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76. Surrounded by family in the house he had built so many decades earlier. Eleanor sat beside him, holding his hand, and whispered the words he had said to her so long ago. That courage won my heart. He squeezed her hand in response, smiled, and slipped away. Eleanor grieved, but she did not fall apart. The courage that had brought her to Texas more than 50 years earlier sustained her now. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, continuing to teach and to write and to be a presence in the community. She lived to see Tommy's twin boys grow into fine young men who loved the ranch as much as their great-grandfather had. She lived to see Katie's oldest daughter graduate from medical school in the East and return to practice alongside her mother. She lived to see William's horses win competitions across the country. She lived to see Margaret's school become a model for education reform throughout the territory. Eleanor died at the age of 82, still sharp-minded and engaged with the world, still the brave woman who had traveled alone across Texas to take a chance on an unknown future. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her teaching, her kindness, and her example of courage and determination. At the funeral, Tommy stood and read from the story his parents had written together, the story of courage and love that had shaped not just their lives but the lives of everyone who had known them. He read the words James had spoken so many years ago. That courage won my heart. And in the reading, in the sharing of that story with a new generation, Eleanor and James's legacy lived on. It lived on in the ranch that continued to thrive under family stewardship. It lived on in the school that bore Margaret's name and educated thousands of children. It lived on in the medical practice where Katie and her daughter healed the sick and injured. It lived on in the horses that bore the Brennan brand and carried riders across the West. But most importantly, it lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard the story and understood its message. That courage matters. That taking risks for something worthwhile is better than playing it safe and living a small life. That true love is built on honesty, respect, and partnership. That the journey, however difficult, is worth taking if it leads to a life of meaning and purpose. Eleanor had traveled alone for weeks to reach his town, demonstrating a courage that had won not just one cowboy's heart, but the respect and admiration of everyone who knew her story. And in the end, that courage had given her exactly what she had hoped for when she answered that matrimonial advertisement so many years ago. A life worth living, work worth doing, and love worth having. The ranch house still stood strong and proud, expanded and improved over the generations, but still fundamentally the same structure James had built with his own hands. The cottonwood trees by the creek grew taller and fuller, providing shade for great-grandchildren who played in the same spot where their great-grandparents had courted. The land continued to support cattle and horses, providing a living for the family that had worked so hard to build something lasting. And in the family Bible, carefully preserved and passed down through the generations, the story remained. The story of a woman brave enough to travel alone across dangerous territory, and a man wise enough to recognize that courage for the rare and precious quality it was. The story of how that courage won his heart, and how love built on that foundation had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. It was a story of the Old West, of a time when the frontier was still wild and life was hard and uncertain. But it was also a timeless story, a reminder that courage and love and partnership can create something beautiful even in the harshest circumstances. It was a story that began with a solitary journey across the Texas plains and ended with a legacy that would never be forgotten. Eleanor and James Brennan had lived their lives with integrity and courage, facing each challenge together and celebrating each joy with grateful hearts. They had built something rare and lasting, not just a successful ranch but a true partnership based on mutual respect and deep love. And their story, written in their own words and passed down through the generations, continued to inspire everyone who heard it to be brave, to take risks, to believe in themselves, and to reach for something better, no matter how difficult the journey might be. The courage that had brought Eleanor to Texas, the courage that had won James's heart so completely, became the defining characteristic of the family they created together. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all carried that legacy of bravery and determination, facing their own challenges with the same spirit that Eleanor had shown on her solitary journey across the frontier. And so the story lived on, a testament to the power of courage and love to transform not just individual lives but entire communities, creating ripples that spread outward through time. Touching lives that Eleanor and James would never know but whose existence was made possible by the choices they made, and the courage they showed in building a life together in the wild, beautiful, unforgiving land they had both learned to call home.